Lindy Chamberlain. Lindy Chamberlain was a mother of 3 when her life was shattered during a 1980 family camping trip to Uluru in Central Australia. One evening, she claimed, a dingo entered the family's tent and took her 9-week-old daughter, Azaria. The body was never found, but the bloody jumpsuit the baby had worn was discovered days later, about 4 kilometers away near a known dingo lair. From the beginning, Lindy and her husband Michael insisted a dingo was responsible, but soon, people and the legal system turned against them. Authorities began to argue that Lindy had staged the dingo attack to cover up the murder of her own baby. The theory was that she left the campfire for just a few minutes, killed her baby, hid the body in a car, returned without anyone noticing any blood or panic, and then raised the alarm. There was no clear motive, and the case relied on circumstantial evidence and really bad forensic analysis. Specifically, there was a claim that traces of baby blood were found in the Chamberlain's car, but that blood later turned out to be a sound deadening spray used during manufacturing. Unfortunately, by then, the damage had been done. In 1982, Lindy was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. She was 8 months pregnant at the time, and after giving birth to her 4th child in custody, the baby was taken from her. Michael was also convicted as an accessory. Appeals failed, and public opinion was split. For years, the media and the public analyzed everything about her, from her expressions to her outfits. Everything changed 6 years later, in 1986, when a hiker discovered Azaria's missing matinee jacket near a dingo lair, the same jacket Lindy had always said her daughter was wearing, despite police insisting it didn't exist. This discovery really shook the case, and just 5 days later, Lindy was let out of prison. In 1988, both she and Michael were officially cleared of all charges. A royal commission later confirmed that the case against them was seriously flawed and said the prosecution hadn't proven they were guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. However, it wasn't until 2012, over 30 years after Azaria's death, that a 4th coroner's inquest finally ruled what Lindy had always said, that a dingo took her baby. The coroner apologized, and the official death certificate was changed. Lindy Chamberlain lost not just her daughter, but years of her life. She went through imprisonment, the forced separation from her newborn, and global defamation. Martha Mitchell. Martha Mitchell, in the early 1970s, saw something no one wanted to see and tried to speak out. What followed was a series of events that should have never happened. Her husband, John Mitchell, was a close ally of Richard Nixon, and when Nixon was elected president in 1968, he named John Attorney General. The couple moved into an apartment in the Watergate complex, and Martha quickly became kinda popular herself. In 1972, however, as John took charge of Nixon's re-election campaign, Martha began to sense something was wrong. She started warning journalists that the campaign was involved in dirty tricks, and days later, the Watergate break-in occurred, when 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic Party's headquarters while trying to wiretap phones and steal documents. John went to Washington immediately, but Martha was held back in California, and what followed was crazy. Her husband enlisted their security agent, a former FBI agent, to prevent her from learning the truth or contacting the media. When she eventually found out that her own daughter's bodyguard had been arrested in connection with the break-in, she tried to call reporters. During one call to United Press reporter Helen Thomas, the line suddenly went dead. When Thomas called back, she was told Martha was indisposed. That night, she was reportedly physically restrained, sedated with a tranquilizer, and left with bruises and stitches. Despite all this, when Martha began telling her story about being forcibly held and silenced, she wasn't believed. The White House and Nixon's inner circle worked to discredit her, framing her as unstable, drunk, and delusional. Even when her husband was convicted and sent to prison for his role in Watergate, Martha was left isolated and living in declining health and poverty. It wasn't until 1975 that James McCord, one of the men arrested at Watergate, confirmed her account. She had, in fact, been forcibly kept from speaking out. Nixon himself would later admit that if it hadn't been for Martha Mitchell, there'd have been no Watergate. But by then, the damage was done. Martha died in 1976 of cancer at age 57. At her funeral, a large arrangement of flowers arrived anonymously with a message spelled out. Martha was right. Richard Jewell. Richard Jewell was a security guard working at the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta when he spotted a suspicious backpack at Centennial Olympic Park. Inside it, there were 3 pipe bombs, and acting quickly, Jewell alerted the authorities and began helping evacuate the area. Thanks to his actions, many lives were saved, but the bomb eventually did detonate, killing 1 woman and injuring over 100 others. In the hours that followed, Jewell was hailed as a hero, but that recognition didn't last. Just a few days later, the FBI named him a suspect, based largely on a psychological profile of a lone bomber who might plant a device to later stage a fake discovery just to be painted as a hero. The press leaned on this narrative, and Jewell's life was thrown into chaos. He was put under 24-hour surveillance, his home was searched twice, and he was continuously portrayed in the media as a failed cop desperate for attention. Even though he was never arrested or charged, the damage was done. He endured a brutal media smear campaign for 88 days, during which his name was completely tarnished. Eventually, though, Jewell was officially cleared, and the Department of Justice admitted the media madness had interfered with the investigation and expressed regret over how he had been treated. Attorney General Janet Reno even stated, "I think we owe him an apology." Years later, in 2005, Eric Rudolph confessed to the bombing, as well as other attacks, confirming that Jewell had been completely innocent all along. Despite being innocent, the whole thing never fully left Jewell. In time, he pursued lawsuits against several media outlets and institutions that had damaged his reputation, and some settled, but others did not. He made it clear that it was never about the money, but about clearing his name. He died in 2007 at just 44 years old, from complications related to diabetes and heart disease, and in 2006, Georgia's governor formally recognized him as a hero, Kotoku Wamura. Kotoku Wamura was the mayor of Fudai, a small coastal village in northeastern Japan. From 1945 to 1987, he led the town through reconstruction after World War II, but there was something troubling him. Having lived through two deadly tsunamis in 1896 and 1933 that killed hundreds, Wamura knew the city needed some sort of protection. In 1967, his administration began constructing a massive 51-foot seawall to protect homes behind the fishing port. But Wamura didn't stop there. He pushed for an even more ambitious project, a giant floodgate at the mouth of the cove where most residents lived. The project spanned 12 years and cost 3.56 billion yen. Many saw it as excessive, even wasteful, but Wamura believed it was necessary. He was constantly mocked for this, but the situation changed on March 11, 2011. A 9-point magnitude earthquake off Japan's coast triggered one of the most devastating tsunamis in the country's history. Waves as tall as 66 feet slammed into coastal towns, but not Fudai. Thanks to Wamura's floodgate and seawall, the village was spared. While some water did overflow, the damage was minimal, and the only death was a fisherman who had left the safety of the barrier to check on his boat. In the aftermath, Wamura's name resurfaced. Unfortunately, though, he had died in 1998, so he had no way of knowing how heroic his idea was. Residents visited his grave in gratitude, recognizing that the floodgate, once ridiculed, had saved their lives. Ignaz Semmelweis. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician who made one of the most important medical discoveries of the 19th century. Yet during his lifetime, he was ignored, mocked, and cast aside. In the 1840s, while working at the Vienna General Hospital, Semmelweis noticed something horrifying. The death rate from childbed fever was dramatically higher in one maternity clinic than in another. After a little bit, he identified one key difference. Doctors in the high mortality ward were also performing autopsies, often going straight from examining corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands. He proposed what now seems obvious. The doctors themselves were carrying deadly particles from cadavers to living patients. In 1847, Semmelweis introduced a hand-washing protocol, and the results were immediate and incredible. Maternal death rates dropped from around 10% to less than 1%. But instead of being celebrated, his discovery was rejected. Most doctors refused to believe that their hands could be dirty. The prevailing theory of the time attributed disease to imbalances in bodily humors, not invisible particles, and some were even offended by the suggestion that they were the cause of their own patients' deaths. Semmelweis was denied academic recognition, forced out of his hospital position, and ultimately left Vienna in frustration. He continued his work in Budapest, where he again saved lives by enforcing hand hygiene, but still struggled to gain acceptance. Over time, his efforts to convince the medical community became more desperate and angry. In the early 1860s, he published a book outlining his findings and began writing open letters to physicians, accusing them of willful ignorance and murder. By 1865, Semmelweis's mental health had deteriorated. He began drinking heavily and was eventually sent into a mental institution. There, he was beaten by guards and died just 2 weeks later from a likely infected wound. Semmelweis's ideas were only accepted years later, after the rise of germ theory through the work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, but by then, he was already gone. Alan Turing. At the start of World War II, Alan Turing joined Britain's code-breaking project at Bletchley Park, the top-secret center where analysts worked to intercept and decode enemy communications. His most significant contribution was breaking the Nazi military's Enigma cipher, a complex encryption system the Nazis used to secure their messages. Before Turing's work, Enigma was considered unbreakable. This breakthrough allowed the Allies to read vast amounts of German military traffic, including messages about U-boat movements in the Atlantic, which were crucial to protecting Allied shipping and turning the tide of the war. Historians estimate that Turing's work shortened the war in Europe by as much as 2 years and saved millions of lives. In 1951, while living in Wilmslow, he met a young man named Arnold Murray and they began an intimate relationship. After a burglary at Turing's home, Turing reported the crime to the police, openly acknowledging his relationship with Murray in the process. At the time, homosexuality was a criminal offense in the UK, so Turing and Murray were both charged with gross indecency. Turing pled guilty, and instead of prison, he was sentenced to chemical castration, a year-long course of synthetic estrogen that caused physical changes, including breast growth and impotence. Murray, by contrast, received only a conditional discharge. As a result of his conviction, Turing lost his security clearance and was banned from continuing his vital cryptographic work with GCHQ, the successor to the wartime code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park. Just 2 years later, in June 1954, Turing was found dead in his home. Cyanide poisoning was listed as the cause of death, and an inquest quickly ruled it a suicide. But others, including his mother and some historians, questioned this version of events. They pointed to Turing's stable mood and his plans for the future. A half-eaten apple laid beside his bed, and many assumed it had been laced with poison. For decades, the British state offered no apology. It wasn't until 2009 that the people began pushing for an official apology. The movement grew, gaining thousands of supporters and the eventual backing of then Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who acknowledged Turing's treatment as utterly unfair. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II formally pardoned him, despite opposition from some who argued that a pardon was not legally appropriate. That pardon sparked the creation of what is now called the Alan Turing Law, which is a legal provision to retroactively pardon tens of thousands of men who had been convicted under historical laws criminalizing same-sex relationships. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or join my Discord to suggest another.